You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 461 of the podcast. And in this one, I chat with Dr. Michael Alcée. Michael is a clinical psychologist, and in it we discuss his therapy story, how Michael works with OCD, the existential story, exposure to feelings. We talk about the topic of the upside of OCD, including 3 particular upsides, his book, The Nuances of OCD, and much, much more. And just want to throw in a kind of disclaimer here, early on, and Michael does express this. Michael is not saying that OCD is not horrible. In fact, of course it is. What he is in fact trying to say, I believe, is that OCD points to certain qualities or characteristics in a person, which I thought is a nice way of viewing it. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. Thank you to all of our patrons for supporting our work. To sign up to our Patreon and to check out the other benefits you'll receive as a patron, please see the link in the show notes. Thank you, as always, to you guys for listening. I deeply appreciate it. And of course, thank you to Michael for his time and expertise. And without further ado, here he is. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Great to be here with you, Stuart.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. So before we get into it, it'd just be good to hear your therapy story. So, why become a therapist or psychologist, and why OCD specifically?
Yeah, the funny thing is I never actually went to therapy specifically for OCD. But I've always been intrigued with therapy because my mother was a social worker, and we always talked about the characters in the stories that we read, and we talked about people, and she was a people observer and what I would call a nuance noticer. And I was a people noticer and a nuance noticer. My 6-year-old son is that. And one of the things that I love about therapy is that it's a playful space to talk about all that we notice in terms of our thoughts and our feelings. And it's an extraordinarily warm, safe place to do that. So for me, therapy always felt like an extension of sort of artful conversation about life, about relationships, about yourself.
Yeah, I like that. And then you then went to train as a psychologist. What led you down that path?
Yeah, it was sort of a little bit of a funny, not surprising accident. When I was in college, I said, I'm going to get away from this profession. I know enough about it. My mom did it. I'm good. And then I did a training at in a psychology class where we had to go, and I worked with what were called juvenile delinquent boys. Mm-hmm. And I was charged with making them feel comfortable enough to talk about what was going on inside. And I thought they were going to hate me. I thought I was going to fail impeccably. But it turns out they really trusted me. And I just noticed how alive I felt in seeing the other dimensions of their stories. And that inspired me to go to grad school. And from there, I decided to get my Ph.D. And I happened to study with some wonderful people, especially in the OCD world. I studied with Dean McKay, who was wonderful and really was encouraging with looking at things from so many different angles.
Yeah, that's awesome. Dean's great. I haven't actually had him on the podcast, so if he's listening, drop me an email.
You should. He's worth it. And I also then trained with Steve Phillipson, a person I know you've had on the podcast too. So just in terms of the OCD cred, I was very connected to understanding it. But as you'll learn more about me, I've often been a bit of an outsider in terms of how I've approached it. And I take different strands from different things.
Yeah. Nice. Well, you're in good company. That's exactly how I view things. And it's kind of the aim of this podcast is to cover what works and the evidence base, and also look a bit beyond that, whether that's standalone integration, the other aspects of being a human, and factoring all of that in. I guess before we get into talking about sort of the upside of OCD, how, just to kind of set it up, how do you work with OCD sort of therapeutically? What are you using therapy wise? What's your approach? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I think all of it comes together. I think it's almost like, Duke Ellington, the great jazz musician, said, "What genre of music do you play, Duke?" And he said, "I don't know, because to me, the great music is beyond category."
Mm.
And when you listen to Duke Ellington jazz, you hear American jazz, you hear gospel, you hear classical, you hear impressionist music. So it's a funny question, and it's not me skirting it. I really bring in a lot of stuff about feelings and
Hmm.
relationships and how that connects. So if you want to label that internally family systems, psychodynamic.
Emotional analytic.
Also, of course, the cognitive in terms of how do these things get translated into thoughts, especially the critical thoughts,
Mm.
right? People with OCD are masters at self-criticism, extremely loving with others, masters at self-criticism. So you can't not use some kind of cognitive approach with that. And also, obviously ACT is this kind of Zen-like mindful
Mm.
way of connecting with it. But of course, also for me, it's always about what's at the heart of it is the existential story.
Mm.
So I'm a humanist at heart, a dynamic therapist at heart, a cognitive therapist in my mind. And,
Mm.
and somehow I think the music that we make together in the sort of improvisatory act of therapy is something I think therapy is really about helping people become more artfully connected to themselves
Mm.
and doing what creativity is, which is learning how to be the same while changing.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. And and just from an exposure ERP point of view, do you ever bring that in, or is that not something you felt you've needed?
Yeah, but the funny thing is, I look at exposure therapy in an interesting way. When I was working in New York City, for my trainings, I would bring people to do all the traditional things, going to like, stores and putting your hands on doors and touching garbages and
Mm.
things like that. So I'm well versed in all the exposure, but I actually think one of the things that we neglect that we can add into our sort of arsenal is exposure to feelings, exposure
Mm.
to the challenging, taboo, phobic feelings that often come up when OCD strikes.
Mhm.
So for me, I don't necessarily label it to my client. We're doing an exposure exercise, but I like to talk about what we're not supposed to talk about and
Mm.
look at what we're not supposed to look at, which is what I think the artist does. The artist likes to talk about what is subversively interesting, but make it safe enough for the culture to look at it.
Yeah. So it's kind of like almost like an internal exposure.
Exactly.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which
Yeah.
is interesting. External exposures often encourage and provide the confidence for external exposure. So I have a client, for example, who I work with who lives in Europe actually. And we actually do exposure exercises where their OCD hits them when they're out in public and they have a hard time, let's say, going on public transport. And so we talk about doing the exposure of getting out there. But while we're going to the exposure, we're talking about the feelings, including the ones about, I feel like I should be doing an exposure today. Well, let's talk about why there's a part of you that doesn't even feel like it. Let's talk about what's been happening in your world right now with whatever's affecting you in the sea of things. So I like to, as you're going to learn about me, I'm very both and. I like to take
Yeah.
this and that and see, as Walt Whitman said, do I contradict myself? Very well. I'm large. I contain multitudes.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. Nice. Yeah, it's a good example. Um, okay, so let's start with quite simply, what is the upside of OCD? Um, and what makes it so helpful for people with OCD? How would you describe it?
Yeah, it's funny. It's because it's a misnomer in a way. And Jonathan Hoffman, I was talking to him
Yeah.
about this. We talked at the not only the conference, we're going to have a little discussion together coming up about it. It's sort of strange. Like, how can you have an upside of a disorder? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And it's and some people might read it at first and get really offended by it. And I want to at least speak to that first. There's no sense of glamorizing or celebrating the disorder.
Hmm.
The upside of OCD, it's just hard to fit into a title.
Yeah.
The upside of OCD actually happens before the OCD even hits the scene. So to put it more simply, I'm a person who's really interested not as much in the disorder as the person with OCD.
Mhm.
And my unconventional take is that people with OCD start with actually very interesting attributes that are strengths, but they easily become challenges, problems. So to talk about the three upsides that people with OCD start with. One, a very, very empathic nature. People with OCD are very good. They have an emotional sixth sense and they can read the feelings of others very quickly and they can internalize it as if it's their own. And then they feel like they have to be responsible for it. They don't necessarily always want to, but they notice all the stuff. There's even research evidence to show that people with OCD are more empathic than even, healthy controls, right?
Hmm.
The second piece of profound feeling is a spark that people with OCD start with, which is very strong. The second is a very imaginative mind. Those of us with OCD, and I include myself in this tribe, we tend to be able to think of all sorts of permutations and possibilities. And of course, our what if scenarios and our worst case scenarios often go front and center. But there's also a lot of nuance and magic and complexity in that imagination when it can be tamed.
Hmm.
The third part is those of us with OCD, before we even get OCD, often are very aware of the existential realities of life. That all of us who are here and all of those people who we love will die.
Hmm.
And if you think about it, I think people with OCD are almost like little existentialists without Jean-Paul Sartre around to give them a language to make sense of it.
Hmm.
They notice the nothingness. They notice the being, but they're haunted by how to deal with that. So in my metaphor, I like to use, I think people with OCD start with these three different sparks that when they're not tended to and learned how to be properly contained and channeled and expressed, they become the house fire that is OCD.
Hmm.
And for my sense of it, the OCD that's burning the house down is often when people go to treatment. And that's usually where ERP treatments and any other treatments begin. And my take is, wait, we should be starting to support, notice, and treat people and help them to mentor them, to help them master how to deal with these very interesting capacities.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. And yeah, just to add on to your disclaimer at the start, you're of course not saying like OCD is a pleasurable thing. You're obviously acknowledging it's horrible, but you're saying forgetting the disorder for a second, it signals really positive traits in people of why they have this disorder. Um, and thinking about, we can also view OCD as a lot of people with OCD as very highly, as you've kind of said this anyway, highly sensitive people, as you said, very attuned to the world and little existentialists. Yeah, and I can definitely relate to that in terms of, before my earliest OCD memory at 7, when I was, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 years old, I remember waking up in the night with these dreams of falling. Like I was this like bottomless emptiness. And this idea of the void is carried with me throughout a narrative in my own therapy. And if that's for me what OCD feels like, if I think about it in a horror sense, it's like this void. And that's what's scary to me. And then I would also have, I would lay awake at night in the dark, like panicking about this existential, well, if heaven's real, it's eternal, and everything after a while becomes boring. So surely heaven will become hell and torture. And I'm not Christian. I don't view heaven that way anymore, even if I was, but as a young kid, I was wrestling with this idea of eternity and it was torturous for me. And I would remember crying at night, laying there. So before OCD, all this was going on. So I guess it just speaks to what you're saying.
Funny coincidence. I was about 7 or 8 when my OCD first really cropped up.
Mm.
And it was again around worrying that my mother, who I loved tremendously,
Hmm.
and who was very sensitive like me, and I felt like she understood these tendencies. But
Hmm.
I was in a classroom with a teacher who I could tell wouldn't respect those tendencies.
Hmm.
And I grew up, with other influences in my life that were not as sensitive to those things. And I had this horrifying obsession that if I didn't pray correctly, because I went to a religious school, if I didn't pray correctly, or if I lapsed in some way, that she would be dead. And I literally remember hugging her at the end of the day as if I really expected her not to be there to pick me up.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because in the genes of my family, my mother had the same worry at the same exact age.
Hmm.
And also, to speak to the point of how, challenging, I saw my mother with a lot of contamination OCD growing up because we didn't have as much education about what OCD was and there weren't as many medications. So I saw all of the pain and suffering. And one of the reasons I wrote the book, especially, is to say that I see exactly the challenge, but I also see a lot of interesting, hopeful optimism within a kind of more full picture of
Hmm.
both the biology and the nature of OCD, but also the way the relationship can heal it.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Maybe speak to the relationship part of being healing, if you can, whether that's in the therapeutic relationship or other relationships.
Yeah, let me give you a story. So I was the other day in New York. It was an October night, and I was at a restaurant where I was just eating by myself. My wife and child were at the in-laws, and I was sitting there at dinner, and I was watching this server, this waitress, and she was really amazing with people. She was noticing what they needed quickly. She was
Mm.
able to find things that they were, oh, you like, yes, I got this blouse here. Really just had a good sense of humor. I could see that she was noticing everything. And she was taking care of all these tables. But of course, she slipped up a little bit. One couple had needed something gluten-free, and it somehow came through. And I could see that it was affecting her. She was my server. And when she came to my table, I said, "Hey, I wanted to tell you something. I'm a psychologist, and I noticed how sensitive you are, how tuned in you are.
Mm.
You're excellent with people." And she said, "Oh, thank you. But I just screwed up that order." I said, "I know, and I could see that's affecting you too." It's so hard when we're so sensitive and aware.
Mm.
But I also was giving her permission that you didn't screw everything up. They're going to be okay. I can hear it.
Mm.
And I wanted her to feel seen for how much of a beautiful thing this was, but also for her not to be alone with the anxiety that she was going to carry into the back room.
Mm.
So I think there's something really powerful that we can do because those of us with OCD, not only do we have this emotional sixth sense, we have an intuitive sixth sense.
Mm.
I didn't know exactly, but I was just picking this up.
Mhm.
I'm sure she was obsessing later and probably going home and thinking she's killed this woman, right?
Mm.
And I think, there's something really powerful about that. And that's what I was talking about when you said, what's an exposure exercise? That was
Yeah.
an exposure exercise of talking about the full picture, the nuanced picture.
Yeah.
And the thing with people with OCD is we tend to go quickly to the negative because people read it quickly, especially people who are not as sensitive will read it. Well, you screwed up. You almost hurt this poor thing. You have to be more on it,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Or not looking at the full picture. She was alone. She wasn't getting enough support with dealing with all these tables. And
Mm.
she was losing energy. And that's where also we need to help people with OCD have not only more self-compassion, but notice like introverts, when they're getting overstimulated, to be able to take a break, to
Mm.
recharge. And that's when I think people get grounded again. So I think relationships are extremely powerful.
Mm.
And by the way, the other thing I see is OCD as an interesting messenger of when I'm not able to do it all. I'm not able to control and take care of everyone. And now the OCD makes me feel like, but if I could do this, I'll be in control. And if I could do that, and it takes away our humanity. And it's also trying to be good. One of the things that people with OCD have a hard time with is being potentially bad.
Mhm.
She didn't mean to harm anybody. And people, Freud said something interesting. He said people with OCD, uh, Basically, people with OCD think that they are as sinful as a mass murderer when they are amongst the most scrupulous members of society.
Mm.
So this
That's,
generosity of self-compassion and this permission to be temporarily bad. I
yeah.
joked to a client, I said, I want you to be a little bit more of an asshole, but not really an asshole, which is an exposure exercise, isn't
Yeah, of
it?
course. Yeah, yeah, absolutely it is. Yeah. I mean, that has been for me. One of my OCD has been around not wanting to offend people and hurt people and all of this. And then my brain would spiral into well, they're going to die if I don't say this right, if I say this wrong, you know. And part of me is I had to become a little bit more of an arsehole, which wasn't an arsehole. It was me just learning to say no to people. And if that didn't like them and upset them, so be it, you know? Or I
It's,
had to say, yeah.
yeah, it's part of actually having these healthy boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's actually the reason I think we're so important right now. I was thinking about this because in America we just had an election
Yeah.
and we've been thinking a lot about where is the state of empathy in our country and in the world. And I think people with OCD really have a high premium of empathy. But then how do you marshal taking care of yourself and having empathy?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the beautiful balance of a real transformational leader is
Mm.
being able to say, I'm going to help with your self-interest, but I'm also going to be empathic. Right. And that's not an easy thing to pull off. And like you're saying, I love what you said about with yourself, that all of a sudden that, we need some practice with learning how to deal with the mixture of boundaries. And I was thinking of also, author John Green talks about his OCD and writes about it. And I think what's interesting if you look at a lot of his stories, there's often a very rebellious, brash character in his stories that, is questioning things, but I think is also his foil in a way. Like you have Asia Holmes in Turtles All the Way Down, who is freaking out about her OCD in all these ways. But you also have like Augustus in The Fault in Our Stars. And one of the things that I think is wonderful about Green's work is that you see him looking at the complexity and fearfulness of living in this world with climate change and living in the world where these potential fragile connections. But you also see this playfulness at trying to be bad. I mean, Augustus in The Fault in Our Stars, one of the greatest scenes is he puts a cigarette in his mouth. And Hazel, who is a cancer survivor, they've just come from a support group, is like, what the, you just ruined this whole thing.
Mm.
And he's like, it's a metaphor. You put the thing that kills you in your mouth and you have control over it.
Mm.
And I think the fact that we can look at these things as a metaphor allows us to play with things, even with being bad.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that people with OCD, I think that's why exposure exercise feels so liberating for people with OCD, because you're given permission to do the wrong thing.
Mm.
I just want to kick that up a few notches in these other ways to say, yeah, but I want you to emotionally be able to be with these sides that, you know what, I really care about you and I really see you, but I need a moment. Like I need a break from my child, or I need
Mm.
a break from my friends or my partner, or I can't be around all these people because I'm feeling all their energy. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I like that. That's a really good way of looking at it. And I didn't realize Freud said that. I was actually at his house last weekend,
Ah,
not visiting him. Obviously,
really?
he's long dead, but his house in London, it's a museum now.
That's
Uh,
so cool. It's so funny. There's this wonderful UK writer and psychologist in Britain who is affiliated with the Freud Museum. His name is
yeah.
Brett Carr.
Okay. I don't
And
know.
he's been a lovely supporter of the book.
Nice.
He's just been so lovely, and I think Freud was very intrigued by the inner experience of OCD because it was the quintessential human dilemma.
Hmm.
How do I protect and honor the people I love, and how do I have my own agency?
Hmm.
It's the poetic dilemma. How do I show how much I love somebody and also acknowledge that I will lose them? It's to
Yeah.
be or not to be. It
Yeah.
is, OCD presents the eternal human question.
Yeah. It's a good point. Yeah, it's a battle between the needs of the self and the needs of others. And I think OCD people often get stuck between those two poles. Where do I
Very,
meet my
and
needs? Where, yeah.
yeah, and also with perfectionistic standards for how much they need to please others and take care of them and regulate them. And I found like in my book, I share a story of my son where it's during COVID and we're in the basement and my eyes fall on a piano bench that was mine when I was a child. And it reminded me of my mother who passed away like 15 years ago. And I was feeling nostalgia, but also sadness that my mother never got to meet my son.
Hmm.
And my almost 3-year-old son, I didn't say a word, but my 3-year-old son said, Dada, why are you sad?
Hmm.
He picked up the energy. And the thing that I did that I think was different than, let's say, my dad would have done is I said, buddy, you're right. I was actually just thinking of somebody that I loved that I missed very much.
Hmm.
And I was sad for a moment, but I also am really glad to think of them again. And I'm okay now.
Yeah.
And so all of that sensitivity that he was like, he could put a place for it. And you know what he said? He moved on right to his playing then. And he knows now that he can tell me about what he picks up on.
Yeah.
That to me is the upside. To
Yeah.
have a little boy with that kind of presence, with that kind of intuition, with that kind of capacity. But I also wanted to protect him. You don't have to take care of me now and feel like you're out of control because you can't handle whatever this is.
Hmm.
So
I
people
like
with
that. Yeah.
OCD, by the way, pick up other people's losses. We pick up
Hmm.
their traumas, the intergenerational trauma. And so I really want people with OCD to see that. And also, by the way, the other thing about people with OCD is they sometimes attract people who have difficulty being with those feelings,
Hmm.
including sometimes narcissists who don't ever want to go to those feelings.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I think they do is because narcissists have no problem with self-interest. They have no problem with being bad. But I think people with OCD can integrate a healthy, assertive, authoritative voice while bringing that together with their empathy.
Hmm.
And do you know who's a really good British example of this?
No?
He's British too. Charles Darwin.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Extraordinarily thoughtful, extraordinarily kind. In fact,
Hmm.
an American researcher, Dr. Keltner, said that Darwin's theory really should have been called the survival of the kindest, not survival of the fittest. And notice what he studied. He studied death, but evolution, how we continue going on. He was
Yeah.
in tune with the great existential dilemma that
Hmm.
most OCD sufferers deal with. And unfortunately, he lost his mother when he was about, very young, like 7 or 8, and it haunted him.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously I think he's reported to have wrote about intrusive thoughts in
Is that
some of his.
right? Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'll double check this before
I'll
I
double
put it
check
live.
too. Yeah. I wouldn't be
If it's
surprised.
still in here now, guys, I've checked, but feel free to check too. But it doesn't mean he had OCD, but he reported sort of wrestling with intrusive type thoughts, I believe.
Yeah, he would ask for reassurance for people. He
Yeah,
would obsess about the health of his children. He worried
there you
that
go.
they would die young like his mom. All sorts of.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, you probably. And I think speaking of the survival of the fittest and what you just said is, I haven't read the book. I've read one of his books, but I'm pretty sure I heard somewhere. And again, don't quote me on the numbers, but it was like he mentions like that a couple of times, but he mentions love like over 90 times or something in that book. And it was a
Yeah.
particular thinker that adopted it and led the narrative of Darwin was talking about, survival of the fittest. And
Yes.
that's why we've used that as culture. And really he was talking about something, as you're saying, much kinder than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And think how that could have shaped society much differently if they
Right.
interpreted Darwin differently.
Right. And I think that's actually a really brilliant connection you're making too, because think also the reason I also wrote about OCD was because I wanted to make a contribution to our culture as well.
Hmm.
I think people with OCD have a great value to our culture in restoring more empathy
Hmm.
and showing the beauty of that empathy. And I think they are the caretakers of that empathy. I think alongside that, being able to have their authority and agency, like I love reading John Green because I think he talks about all these extremely important issues for all of us, right?
Hmm.
I think Greta Thunberg has talked about her OCD as well as her autism, and some of the OCD I think inspires her climate advocacy, right? And then I'm really excited about other people in the public eye who talk about OCD not just as a problem, but as part of a sensibility. Jack Antonoff talks about, the record producer and musician talks about, how his kind of capacity to notice things in a track, notice different things, and also worry about things as well. And Camila Cabello, all these people, and I think having, or even Nikola Tesla had this interesting counting obsession.
Mm.
um, so I just think I want us to kind of um, reappraise not only what's in OCD, but what's there before it, and what more richness and wealth people have with OCD, and what they can give to themselves and give to the world.
Yeah, and like, Eminem's one that sticks out for me because I don't know whether he has OCD. He says he does.
I didn't know that he did. That's interesting. That's
Yeah,
fascinating.
I'd love him to be on the podcast if he's listening.
Yeah, please,
Yeah,
please.
yeah, it'd be awesome. But he's talked about it in minor detail before. But if he does, it makes sense. Like he's one of the best lyricists or poets we could call him of all time. Like he's incredible with words, and his
Yeah.
ability to obsess over that and think it through and be creative in his brain, which his intrusive thoughts would have been super creative, and he's just
And what
pushed that
makes sense about
into.
that too is that I think in his art, there's ways in which he needs to play with the villainous persona, the trickster persona, because when we can allow room for that, it integrates with the kinder parts of us as well.
Yeah.
And I think, that's the best exposure because, and just back to Freud's comment, I jokingly tell people who have OCD, you're never really going to become an asshole. You're never really going to become a narcissist. You're never going to become the mass murderer. You just not are built that. You aren't built that way. And you have this already internal check on yourself. But when you do bring it together, you're going to marshal all that empathy in much more interesting, creative ways.
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant. I like it. So your book, The Upside of OCD, what are some of the key takeaways that you would want people to get from it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think one thing is, I think something that we tend to do because, especially because, cognitive therapy is so important and popular in the OCD world, is I think we focus on thoughts a little bit more than we focus on feelings. So I'd like people to not just slow it down, but to say, yeah, I'm thinking this. But I think people with OCD tend to use their mind to manage things and even try to find a solution within the mind. And so I want people to kind of notice and dig down and sort of like when I have like an OCD, I often will have an OCD. I've tracked this now. I often get OCD worries about a toothache and what the potential is for not getting that filled and disease and all sorts of stuff. And usually when I say, wait a minute, what else am I feeling that I don't want to notice? It happened during COVID when I was freaked out about lockdown and feeling, oh, this is unpredictable. I think getting into those softer, more vulnerable feelings, especially those feelings that we feel, fear, anger, sadness, envy, all of those things that the good part of us doesn't want to necessarily admit. And also they don't feel very in control. So finding your feelings first, because we know that engaging the compulsion and engaging the obsessions, it sort of becomes a vicious cycle. And so this kind of leads to the next step, which is try to notice and lean into the nuance, even if it contradicts.
Mm. Yeah.
Right? Like it contradicts that all of a sudden I'm getting this really aggressive obsession about wanting to hurt somebody. Right?
Yeah.
And now am I a really terrible person? But maybe I'm angry, or maybe I feel like they've stepped on my toes in a way, and I don't want to admit that. And maybe it's okay to have the nuance that I love my mom sometimes, or I love my brother, or I love my significant other, but sometimes I really don't like them. And can I be with that ambivalence? Can I be with the nuance? It's sort of just like, can I hate a political supporter of the candidate who I despise? Can I hate them, but also realize that there's not a part of me that's going to kill them off just because of that,
Mm.
right? And can I be with the mixture of that strangeness? And so I call it going from the negative to the nuance, because I think we try to control it with the negative of I'm only this bad person, or I only am going to go to the bad places. But usually, and this is I think something about creativity, creativity often happens when we allow mixtures of different things to go back and forth with each other.
Mm.
Not just to collide, but to converse.
Yeah.
And there's a courage that is there. And remember how I said feelings are important? You know where the word courage comes from, according to existentialist Rollo May? From cœur, which means heart.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So focusing on feelings and connecting those feelings in the body to the mind is connecting body and mind in a way. And that's where I think the Zenful mindfulness part is great. I think the like allowing your thoughts to just be thoughts. But then I want to add with that, what could this be telling me? So for me, OCD is like a wonderful, actually a very vexing magic act.
Mm.
It will distract us. It will say to me, Mike, your real problem is that you have a toothache and now you're going to not get it filled and you're going to get this disease and you're going to die and you're going to give it to your family and all that kind of stuff. So the distraction part is it's going to make me focus on the toothache as if it's the main event. It's the sideshow. I jokingly talk about it's like a Law and Order episode, which is like a crime procedural in America. When you think the first character who you suspect is the guy, he's never the guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So OCD distracts us, but it's trying to focus us. And if we can be a little bit more creative about, wait, what is this trying to tell me?
Mm-hmm.
What message could this be that's unexpected? And some of that requires a little humility. OCD, you're trying to tell me that I'm sad and scared that COVID has hit and I don't feel any control. And now you're making me think about whether I have a tooth that really needs addressing. That's creative. That makes sense. I can be with those feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. And this speaks to OCD as a defense. Like
Yes.
the psychodynamic view of OCD is it's a defense against something we don't want to experience, which is what partly Freud said. He had a couple conceptualizations, but and it kind of makes sense. And what you were saying about an example from my own life today was, I don't think it's much OCD, more anxiety, but I was in my office this morning at work where I do my therapy room, and it's a very old building, 100, 150 years old. And I'm in the eaves, so the roof is right there, and it looked like it was damp. And it wasn't where it was quite painted right, but it was really cold when I touched it. So I don't think it was a compulsion. I generally needed to check. But then I touched other parts to compare, and they were also really cold. So a part of me thinks it's probably not damp. But what was really worrying me about it was not that, there could be damp there, because I wouldn't have to pay for that. It would be the landlord, because I'm just renting a room. Totally. But yes, there's the worries of I don't want damp. And my brain did start to go, well, what happens if mold develops and all of this?
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't, and the first glance, it was the worry that, no, it's damp and maybe there's going to be mold and all of this. But then when I stepped back and thought about it, it was no, I would have to have tough conversations with my landlord. I would have to fight them to pay a lot of money to do the roof and pull their finger out and take action and all of this. And what scares me is the confrontation of that, because once upon a time, I never would have been able to do that. But it's reminding myself, no, I would be able to handle it now, and I would find a way through because I've developed the skills and resiliency. And then I felt a lot more calm about the whole situation, and I'm not worrying about it.
I love it.
There's this fear I wouldn't be able to cope.
And I love it. There's three dimensions that I just want to highlight on that, which I think are brilliant. The way those of us with OCD can notice very minute and subtle details, and we'll try to source them. And at first, sometimes we'll say, just like you said, I've done this too. I thought a smell was gas in my house last year at one point. And I went down in the basement. I'm like, there is something different in here. I don't know what it is. So I had to call the fire department. Check, no gas. Well, I was right. It wasn't gas, but it was something. One of my old humidifiers, the motor burnt out. So I was right. There was something wrong. But what I was nervous about was all the worst case scenarios like you, of having to confront this, of having to deal with it. And what I love what you did with that situation was noticing those feelings there
Mm.
that were connected to, I know something is up. I'm not right sure exactly, but I know there's something wrong. But I also am afraid because if I have to deal with that, I have to assert my voice and maybe use some of my own power, which feels like confrontation, that feels like the land of difficulty for those of us with OCD. But I think you're right. The more we integrate this side of our healthy sense of agency, we don't have to do all this alone. And I think that's what OCD tries to do for us. It tries to say, you should be able to do this and fix everything and save everybody. And if you can't, then what's wrong with you? Rather than this is just being fully human. And it's hard to be human and so aware. I would say
Yeah.
those of us with OCD are so exquisitely aware. And yet, that is both the gift and the rub.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I really like that. And what also comes to my mind there is like the yin and yang symbol,
Yeah.
um, the chaos and order. And I think with OCD, a lot of the time, I'll speak generally, I don't want to speak for everyone, but we can feel everything needs to be perfect or just right. And if it's not, that's awful and life's terrible. And when actually life is constantly flipping between chaos and order and this yin and yang, and that's existence, not this everything's okay perfection, because that's just not reality. And I think sometimes it's balancing back into that. It's okay if something's triggered me. It's okay if something's off, but it doesn't mean it's going to be off forever. It's just, this is part of life right now, and it will change again because it constantly flips.
And I'm looking up this definition. So there's a writer named Brad Stolberg. He's written this wonderful book called Master of Change. And it's all about how, as human beings, it's so difficult to deal with change. And he talks about this metaphor that we often think about when it comes to change is homeostasis, which is right, getting back to your equilibrium point. But he says we've misunderstood that even biologically. We do try to come back to set points, but that's the over controlling part of us. It's more what I think is called allostasis, which is getting at a set point that even changes and that we're constantly. And so, in other words, we're not wrong by trying to find some equilibrium, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same. And we could actually grow, and we do grow and evolve, and that's built into us. So I think kind of recognizing, and that's what I think was brilliant about Darwin. He was like saying, wait a minute. We do evolve and we do change, but it's a little bit more nuanced and more interesting than we thought it was. But that doesn't take away who we are. And I think people with OCD need to see this, that we're in touch. Yeah, I think Jung had this wonderful quote. Let me see if I have it. It's in my book here somewhere. So Jung has this great quote that is perfect for all of humanity, but it's especially essential for those of us with OCD. Because we notice so much change and it's hard to figure out how to stay the same. So Jung says, it seems that all true things must change, and only that which changes remains true. Now, is that like not a brilliant exposure?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like we can be changing, and that actually allows us to be truly ourselves.
Yeah.
And to embrace the complexity and the nuance and the beauty of that in ourselves and in others. And the other thing too is what's hard about being so emotionally tuned in is that, we're all emotion regulation machines. And we're all changing all the time. And just like, especially like I have a 6-year-old, you have a 4-year-old, like you notice like how easily that can change, but that's not a design flaw. That's a design virtue.
Yeah.
And to be able to embrace that in a human way that recognizes it's not easy to figure out how to creatively work with that, but it's also extremely exciting and joyful. And I think leaning into that is the upside.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Wow, awesome. Thank you so much. And before I ask you a couple completely different random questions,
Please. Yeah.
is there anything else you want to say on the upside or anything else about OCD?
No, I think, like I said, I think I think OCD is a very tenacious critic. It's a very diabolical creature. And one of my mentors said, diabolical comes from the Greek for tears you apart. But the opposite of diabolical is symbolic. And I think the creative ways in which we symbolically talk with each other and help stitch together these feelings and thoughts in more nuanced ways, I think that's the symbolic art that we need to not only help heal OCD, but to help others learn from what those of us with OCD see and notice.
Yeah. Nice.
And
Yeah.
that is the muse.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for adding that. So slight change of direction.
Please.
You could pick up the phone and call the 20-year-old you. What do you tell him?
Yes, I would tell him this difficulty you have with feeling like you don't know who you are and where you are is because you're picking up everything around you. And one day you will come to see that it is quite a wonderful thing. But I feel you right now. You're hurting because, it's like that old Leonard Cohen song, the Hallelujah song.
Yeah.
He said something to the effect of, he was trying to show us that the world can be a cold and lonely and difficult and beautiful place. And that is when we understand the Hallelujah. And I don't think I understood at 20 that Hallelujah could even exist.
Yeah. That's awesome. And again, I think Freud said something similar-ish to that effect of, was it in retrospect, all the years of suffering would be the most beautiful?
I was thinking of that same quote. I was going to point, that's true.
Which is a hard quote to accept and wrestle with, but it's interesting.
It only feels better in retrospect, that quote.
Oh, 100%.
And that's why I give such a big hug to that 20-year-old who says, that's cold comfort, my friend.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. In retrospect, that quote makes sense. Yeah, I was speaking to someone today about saying, it took me 20 years to get effective treatment from my first symptom of OCD. And I could see them kind of shake their head in I guess, empathy for me. And I thought, younger me deserved that empathy because it was hell. But now I wouldn't change a thing because I really like where I'm at and who I am. And if I changed anything, something would be different. Do I want to time travel and go through all that again? Hell no. But now that it's somewhat over, I'm grateful, Well,
that's what I meant about that quote, that the changes allow you to realize how true you've been all along.
True.
And I agree with you. I think one little limitation that I would also add in is I think it's sad and unfortunate that it takes so long to get proper treatment. I'm glad that there's more awareness out there. I think there's more people talking about the richness and diversity of the experience, not just the bad, but all of it.
Yeah.
And I think also it's really important for us as a field, as clinicians, to do a lot like we're doing here, talking about all these different ways that we can bring everything at our disposal together.
Absolutely. Yeah, true. And then you've got a billboard. What do you want written on that billboard?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it would be simply, I've used this expression before, which is to live life creatively. I think I work at Manhattan School of Music with a lot of musicians and in their counseling center. And it strikes me always that artists don't think they're creative personally, and non-artists don't think they're creative in any way. And I think that the true beauty of being human is to actually embrace the creativity of living.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I like that. And what jumps out at me is one of the things that really separates us from most other animals, even mammals, is creativity.
Yeah.
Because, whales are very intelligent and empathic and all of this, but I don't see them that creative. I mean, maybe they are in the flips they do in the ocean and stuff, but they're definitely playful, but doesn't mean they're creative. And I think that's a uniquely
I think
human
that's also
thing.
I think that's also a great kind of, when people worry about AI, I think, yes, of course, it could be creative to a certain extent, but it can't be creative in the kind of human way and the related way.
Yeah.
And that there's something in that technology that is just magnificent that we should marvel at.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Yeah. And then lastly, is there anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
Oh, I shared too much already now, didn't I? No.
Never.
No, I've been just so grateful to you because I've been watching your show with loads of other wonderful guests, and
Thank you.
I've imagined what I might say, and I have to say it was more fun than I even imagined. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for your work and willing to look at OCD slightly differently. I appreciate it. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. And if you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.